What an amazing time to celebrate. Love the theme of joy that's coming through. I think that's an important theme for our family, for our crew, and so many of the things that we've walked through. To remember that God has lots of joy for his children and stirs our heart with that joy to worship him. I've got about 25 minutes here and about 35 verses. Not as many as last week. I had 50 last week. Okay, if you're new this Sunday, don't worry. We don't go quite like that. But I did have 50 verses last week, mostly because I was bitter about the Super Bowl. And the Super Bowl was, as boring as it might have been to go through 50 verses, the Super Bowl was worse than that. Right? I know. It was a bad Super Bowl. But we've been working through the book of Acts, and the title of the series is Finish the Mission. So what happens in Acts is the history of how God sparked this movement called the church, the family of God, and he put them in motion. So if you follow Jesus, if you're a Jesus follower and you're gathering in this space, we often talk about the church, we think about the church like the building, but really it's the community or the assembly of the gathering of the family of God. If you're assembling together under the name of Jesus, you're in motion. Okay, so you're following Jesus and you're working and moving through the mission of God. And we put a hashtag on that. It says, can't stop, won't stop. And the reason it can't stop, won't stop, is we see is text after text after text, verse after verse after verse, is that there is major opposition to the movement of God. There's major opposition to the work of healing and redemption that he's doing in the world. And that redemption is often very obvious there's a very clear villain sometimes. As we saw last week, we saw a crowd that was rioting, a crowd that was racist, that called Greeks filthy, right? And so we see a clear villain sometimes. Sometimes we see not as clear, right, of the opposition. Sometimes we see good people under the desire to remain safe, under the desire to not take any big risks or not to be rejected, to not move forward in the mission. And this week we're going to zero in on the very heart of Paul himself, because sometimes the opposition is clear. There's a person we're facing. There's opposition coming at us. Sometimes it's not so clear. It's people we love that just want us to be safe and healthy and doesn't want us to be in any kind of danger. Someone was asking me the other day, well, how do we impact the most broken parts of our community? And I said, we'll never reach the most broken parts of our community if safety is something we believe God always wants for us. You cannot move into the most broken places of our community unless you know that God calls us into places that are sometimes unsafe. That he often puts us in spaces where we're going to be vulnerable to reach those places. And so oftentimes that's the opposition, just the desire that we love one another and we don't want any harm to come to those that we love. But what we're going to see today is that there's something going on in the heart of Paul. As bold as Paul is, as courageous as Paul is, when we get to this text, Paul is old, Paul is tired, and Paul is beat down. If you were here last week as we covered 50 verses, we saw Paul had his homecoming back in Jerusalem. And when he had his homecoming, he tried to please the crowds by taking a vow. But the crowds weren't pleased. People pleasing never works. Tried to please the crowd. They weren't pleased. He took a 7-day vow. They didn't care. They still tried to kill him in the streets, right? And then Paul pleads with him. He gives his testimony. He goes, man, I was just like you. I was zealous for the law. I hated the way. I hated Christians, but I met Jesus. And he was pleading with them, hoping that their eyes would come open, that their hearts would come open, and that they would see Jesus. But they don't. In fact, the riot gets intense. And so the commander, the tribune we see of the city, he's got about 1,000 soldiers under his command. He gets pulled into the story. And this is kind of, if maybe when you imagine your head, and I don't mean to be disparaging in any way, but this is kind of like your small town sheriff. Okay? Except there's a big thing going on. And when he shows up, it says a little phrase about him. It says he could not discern the facts. All right. And that was kind of funny because that's what happens. He shows up and he says he couldn't figure out what the crowd was saying. So he just arrests Paul. And then he confuses Paul to be the commander of an army of assassins, Egyptian assassins. Now, this is a Bible preacher who's an old man. And he goes, aren't you that Egyptian that's got assassins in the desert? But that's not the only time he gets confused. Later on, he's about to beat him again just to make the crowd happy. Right? The crowd wants him beaten. The crowd wants him killed. And so he gets the Roman soldiers, says, okay, we're going to beat him and kill him. And then Paul goes, hey, don't you know I'm a Roman citizen? And by law, if he beats a Roman citizen without a trial, he could be killed. He had no idea who Paul was. He was completely confused. Now that's interesting, and it's a good opener into this part of the text because he's going to move into the front of the story. He's going to move into the front of the story because we're going to ask ourselves the question, Paul's in prison. How will the mission go forward? That's my friend. How you doing? Good to see you. Yeah, that's all right. You can talk back to me. Anybody can talk back to me. It's all right. So Paul shows up. He's in prison. How is the mission going to go forward? So check it out. We pick it up. And this commander, it says on the next day, after he'd thrown him in prison, after he learned he was a citizen, a Roman citizen by birth, Paul is, the next day, the commander, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, the commander unbound him and commanded the chief priests and the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them. So he gets them, he's got a safe place, he pulls them together, he gets all the chief priests and all the council, and they set him down. And Paul, looking intently at the council, says, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood next to him to strike him on the mouth. Now, that's a lot of fun. Imagine if trials went down like that today. Hey, I want you to tell us what's going on. We're going to be questioned. And as soon as you start talking, the chief priest, the guy that's kind of in charge for the Jewish community says, hey, punch that guy in the mouth. That would just make me a lot more careful about what I said, I think, And so he gets punched in the mouth, and Paul says to him, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall, which is an echo of what Jesus said to religious leaders back in the Gospels. You remember when Jesus was talking to the Pharisees and they were all cracking down on him for loving on prostitutes, loving on tax collectors, and they were saying, how are you touching all these dirty people? And he says, you're like a whitewashed tomb. You're pretty on the outside. You got it all together. You keep all the rules, but in the inside, you're like a rotting body. And so Paul responds in the echo of Jesus, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? Yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck? And those who stood by said, would you revile the God's high priest? And Paul, in amazing humility, says, I didn't know, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, you should not speak evil of a ruler of your people. That's amazing self-control. I don't know many men with that kind of self-control to get punched in the face and yelled at, and then to have the self-control to be humble even in that moment. That's where Paul's at this moment. Now Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other part were Pharisees, and he cried out in the council, brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of a Pharisee. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. So he's got these two religious leaders, and one of the religious groups, they're Sadducees, and that's the more liberal side of Judaism. In other words, they didn't believe in a literal afterlife. They believed that when you died, that was it. And the Pharisees took the Old Testament literally. They believed in the commands of God and everything that the Old Testament said literally. And so what they said is, hey, when you die, there's a resurrection of the body. God is working, and there will be an afterlife with God forever. And Paul knows that they disagree. And so he says, it is respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. Paul knows how controversial, and he knows the offense of the resurrection. Do you know that moralism is not offensive? Do you know that being a moral Christian, being a moral person, having a moral religion is offensive to no one? Everyone you talk to is on a pathway to trying to be a better person. Everyone's on a pathway to saying, you know what, I want to be less selfish. I want to be less prideful. I want to be kinder to other people. You know, no one's really offended when someone shows up and says, hey, here's a way to be a better person. And everyone's going, I think I am a pretty good person, but it'd be nice to know if I could be a better person. Maybe what do I need to do to be a better person? No one's offended by that. But it is deeply controversial to say that God died because you and I could never be good enough. It is deeply offensive to say that you and I are so devastatingly broken that God had to lay down his life because you and I could do nothing to move 1 inch in his direction on our own. That's offensive. That cuts at the core of our autonomy and our pride. And it says you can do nothing without Jesus. And then to say that he rose from the grave, that he conquered the grave, and he's not dead, means that you don't have the choice of saying, well, as long as I'm a good moral person, everything's okay. No, he either is alive or he's not alive. And if he's alive, he's Lord. If he's alive, he's king. And so when he speaks out the controversy of the hope in the resurrection, it just stirs up a lot of conflict. Because that's the point. That's the moment where everyone's going to come face to face with whether or not they're just going to be a good person who kind of does things their own way, or whether or not King Jesus is going to own their life. But this is the only thing Paul has any confidence in. The resurrection of Jesus is the only source of his confidence. If you look over to 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it's one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. It's not talking about his time in Rome, but it is talking about a time in Asia, very similar. And it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8, he says, for we do not want you to be ignorant, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened. Another translation says, crushed beyond our strength, that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. What he says is, I've got one confidence. So he gets in a moment where there's a riot. He's in a moment where he's being punched in the mouth. He's in a moment where there's pressure on him. And he says in front of that whole group, I'm here because I have one confidence. And that confidence is that there is a God and he died to gather his children and he's not dead anymore. He's alive. You know, it takes a lot of pressure sometimes in our life to strip away things we would put our confidence in. And Paul's old enough now where anything he could put his confidence in is gone. He's not confident anymore in his education. He's not confident anymore in his physical ability. He's sick. He's old. He's hurt, right? He's not confident in his popularity. He has nothing he can hang on to say, that's why I would be accepted to God, and that's why anybody should listen to me. He's got one confidence, and it's that God lived, God died, and God rose again. That's it. And so he stands in the heat and in the teeth of opposition with one confidence. And he says, the reason you guys want to kill me right now is because I've only got one hope, and it's in the resurrection from the dead. That's powerful. You know, if Jesus is alive, there's some pretty cool things that are realities for us. There's some pretty amazing realities for us if Jesus is alive. One, he speaks. So this isn't just, sign your name down on a piece of paper and show up and sit in a chair and give your tithe and be a part of a good religion. No, God speaks to you because he's alive. His presence is real. Yeah, you may battle like I often do with loneliness, but God's presence is real. He is a real person who fills the room and comes close in the most oppressive places. He's real. He's alive. That's because he's not in the grave. He comforts. He heals. Right? There's so many realities that we have available to us because our God's not dead. I feel like it should be Easter, but it's not Easter. But he's not dead. And that's why the mission can't stop, won't stop. Because we've got a God who's heavily invested in what he put into motion. He's heavily invested. So some stuff continues to happen to Paul. He puts his confidence and his hope in the resurrection. And then the crowd, you think, man, that's awesome. Man, that's news. Man, Jesus is alive. But that's not what they do. It says, for the Pharisees, the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, no angel, no spirit. But the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So they're arguing now. And then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisee party stood up and contended sharply. Oh, we don't think there's anything wrong with this guy. He agrees with us. And then if a spirit or an angel spoke to him, maybe, that's what's going on. And a dissension became violent. So I don't know if you've ever argued theology with anybody. I used to do that in seminary all the time. We used to argue theology. I've never been in a theological argument where the conversation got violent. I don't know if you have, but that's a problem. Okay? Like if we're talking about the Trinity and all of a sudden someone's like, all right, dude, we're going to the floor. There's a problem with what's happening here. But it becomes violent, and the tribune, the commander, he's afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. Now, why would a guy be afraid someone's going to be torn to pieces? You get the image in this area that the two parties have laid hands on Paul, and they're pulling Paul. In chaotic craziness, they are pulling him apart. And the commander goes, you're about to be ripped limb from limb. I got to get you out of here. And he gets him out, and he pulls him back and takes him to the barracks. And this is where our text gets really cool. Paul stands up in the boldness God's always given him to speak the truth about the resurrection of Jesus to people who aren't accepting it. He's been doing that for years now. He's been punched in the mouth. He's had rocks thrown at him. He's been kicked out of cities. He's had a long journey, and he's back in his home. He's back at the place where he started, and he's had another conversation where he's preached Jesus, and another punch been thrown, and another rock, and everything being torn apart from him, and now he's stuck in a Roman barracks. And God shows up, and God speaks. And look what the Lord says. He says the following night, take courage. Isn't that awesome? Take courage. Why does Paul need to hear that? Why, is he Superman and punches don't hurt? No, they hurt. Is it discouraging to Paul that the people he used to go to school with, the other Pharisees that he used to be among, reject him and think he's a fool, think he's an idiot? Yes, that matters because he's a real person. Is he emotionally exhausted? Probably. Emotionally exhausted from pleading and pleading and pleading and getting rejected again and again and again and again? Absolutely. Is he physically devastated? I was talking to a dad the other day, and he said, I work. I get up at 5:30. I work all day long. I come home, and everybody needs me. Everyone's pulling on me. I challenge my kids and how they should live. I'm struggling in my communication with my wife. And he says, I fall into bed and I'm emotionally gone. I've got nothing left in the tank. I'm trying to follow Jesus. I'm trying to be a good husband. I'm trying to honor God in everything that I'm doing, but I am devastated. And what he said to me is, I don't know if I have anything left in the tank to work on some of the stuff going on in my family. I know it's got to get worked on. I know I've got to lean into it. I know my presence is needed. I know I have to follow Jesus here. I know I have to stand up for what's true. I know that I've got to walk into these moments, but I don't have anything left in the tank. Does anybody feel like that? Maybe you don't feel that way this morning, but maybe you felt that way in this season. Maybe you've felt that way in a season in the past, but if you haven't felt that before, let me just make a prediction. You will. You will be in a place where you're tapped out. You will be in a place where you've given it your best. You've tried your hardest. You've leaned into all the difficult things going on. You've tried to have all the tough conversations. You've tried to do everything you can to honor God, and you are tapped out. That's why the Lord has to show up and say, take courage. Take courage. Take, Paul, and here's what he says. And I don't know about you, but this is crazy. He goes, Paul, take courage. For just as you have testified about the facts of me here in Jerusalem, so you must also go to Rome. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm old and I've been beat up a bunch of times, I'm thinking Jerusalem's where I'm going down. Like maybe I'm okay with dying for the faith. I'm okay laying down my life for Jesus. But come on, like I have eaten all kinds of food because I've gone to all kinds of cities and places. I'm tired of eating weird food. I'm tired of talking to weird people. I'm tired of weird customs. I'm tired of being rejected. I'm tired of being kicked out. I'm tired, done. And Jesus is like, no, you got to go to Rome. He doesn't say, hey, Paul, could you go to Rome for me? Look what it says. It says, you must go. You must go. Take courage, Paul. You must go. Do you know that there is stuff you must do? Your God sees you, loves you, knows exactly how you feel, where you sit, and he's got something left for you to do. And the reality is you kind of know it. You know deep down in your soul, there's something churning in you that you must do. It's not that you want to do it necessarily. It's not that you feel like you can do it necessarily. But the Spirit of God and the risen King is in your space saying, take courage. There's something you must do. Now, how could Paul put any confidence in that? He's in the barracks at a Roman prison. It makes no sense that he's going to get to Rome. How in the heck is he going to get to Rome? How is he ever going to get from there in Jerusalem to Rome? He's in a prison. There's no door, right? God opened the door for me. There's no door. He may not even be able to walk very well right now. He's been traveling by foot in a lot of places. He may be going, I don't know if I can, how am I going to trek my way to Rome? By the way, there's bodies of water, Lord. Did you know that? There's some bodies of water I got to get over. I don't know if you know that, God, but I don't know if I can get across the water to get to Rome. Like I'm not a good swimmer. I don't know. I'm just guessing. I don't know if Paul's a good swimmer or not. You know what's interesting is later in one of his letters, he writes a verse that's pretty familiar to all of us, but I don't know if we've seen it in this context. But check out what it says in Ephesians 2:10. In Ephesians 2:10, after Paul writes one of the most amazing descriptions of the gospel, which is that we've been saved by grace through faith in Christ alone. By grace we've been saved. Then he says something to people who've been saved by grace. He says in verse 10, for we are his workmanship. You're his masterpiece. Another translation says, we were built together and knit together by God, for we are his workmanship, so that no one may boast. That's the verse above. Sorry, I got confused. We're his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we could walk in them. Here's what he's saying. I know you got me mixed up. Here's what he's saying. You're built by God, and God has a path for you to walk. Do you know that God is committed to opening the door to the path he wants you and I to walk? So when God says beforehand, I built you together, you're my masterpiece. I created the way you think. I created every part of your personality, and I put it together for a path I want you to walk. That God is committed to making sure the path is available for you to walk. He's committed to that. Now, it may not look like what you and I think. In fact, it probably will look like nothing like what we think. And yet, God is fully committed. Paul's confidence. Paul doesn't argue with God. Why does he not argue with God? Because he knows he's made by God, and God made him for a path to walk. God made you and I for a path to walk. So, take courage. Take courage. No matter how tired you are, no matter how broken you feel, no matter how exhausted you are physically, take courage. There's a place you must go. There's a thing God has for you and for me. Take courage. And you go, well, what's going to happen? How's all this going to work? I think we might be blown away if we sit back and we watch and wait God open our pathway. We might be surprised that a commander who can't get the facts right. Okay, we know who we're talking about here. A commander who can't get any of the facts right all of a sudden becomes the hero of the story. How is Paul going to get to Rome? I don't know. He's in a prison. He's getting beat up. This Roman guy doesn't care about him at all. But I tell you what he does care about. He cares about the fact that he now has a Roman citizen. And if this Roman citizen gets hurt, he's going to be in trouble. That's all he cares about. So God's networking a story and a path. And all of a sudden, look what happens. Then it was the day the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who made this conspiracy, and they went to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we've killed Paul. That's dedication. Not going to eat or drink until we kill you. That's an oath I will never take. I am not putting my eating or drinking on the line for anything. I can't even give up coffee. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the commander to bring him down to you, bring Paul down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. In other words, we're going to act like we want to hear it better, so maybe bring Paul down, and then we'll kill him before he comes near. Now, the son of Paul's sister, where does this guy come from? I've never heard of this guy. I didn't even know Paul had a sister. This is the first time you've ever heard of Paul's sister. So Paul's sister has a son. Who knew that? He's hanging out where these guys are talking about killing Paul. How does Paul's sister's son get in a place where they're going to kill Paul? I don't know. But that's how God works in our path. You and I have no idea who God is networking. We have no idea who he's positioning in just the right place to hear the right thing. We have no idea who's sitting behind the table at lunch when we're talking about the things going on in our heart. We have no idea whose pathway is walking around us, that God is navigating all around us to hear just the right thing, to say just the right thing at the right moment that opens the door for what we must do next. But I promise if we're watching and we're listening, we'll catch it. But we'll never be able to control it. In other words, you and I are not going to be able to make it happen the way we think it ought to happen, with the people we think it ought to happen with.